specialized in word learning and vocabulary learning in children. So my talk here will be about novel name learning in young children. So maybe if I was asking you what is word learning, what does it mean cognitively for a young kid? Many people would say it's a question of an association between a novel word and novel stimuli, and that would be as simple as that. And when you are looking for picture books for children, and also if you are talking with many teachers in language, they probably would endorse, most of them, this kind of view. Unfortunately, it may not be as simple as this, and there are many reasons for that. So one question is, can we use the lessons of cognitive psychology and cognitive development methods to see whether it's possible to devise new methods to learn and to teach novel word meaning, and then also novel word learning. And what do I mean by novel word learning? Is two things. Of course, learning the association between the word and the objects, but also to generalize those novel words to new situations in the future. So my summary of my talk is that, so I'm going to illustrate my main question and tell you what is the main hypothesis. And the main hypothesis is that comparing stimuli help learning and generalization. And I'll show you briefly a couple of results that show that. And then maybe, if I have still time, psychological factors that might be involved, meaning that all the children might not be in the same situation when they learn these novel words. So how do we learn, how do young children learn the meaning of novel words? Most of the time they are shown maybe directly an object and name is given. Or in the picture book that might be exactly the same. We might see a picture of an apple and the person, either the teacher or the mother or the father, say it's an apple. So there is an association which is created. Another type of pictures could be scenes with multiple pictures, like here. So you have a category of fruits, and then you tell the child if these are all fruits, and you give the name of each fruit. Nothing really interesting here. Or you could start with a scene. For example, you could say, oh, these are the foods that can be met, that you can find in at breakfast, and then you give the name of all of them. Or even you could sometimes, all these examples are coming from picture books. You could have this kind of very messy scenes with all objects here. I'm sorry, it's in French. All in this messy scene, you have all objects coming, or plenty of objects coming from a house, and most of them are completely unrelated. For example, there is no semantic relation between a bed and let's say a bicycle, or between a toothbrush and what would I say, or a shower or whatever. So it's completely messy, and according to a psychologist like me, it's not the best situation to learn language, because it's a very interfering situation, because there are plenty of words on one side and plenty of pictures on the other side, and reminding all the connection because all these words and these object is not that obvious, cognitively speaking. So, as I said, it's not as easy as association. There is more than associations. And what is the more? The more is that children have to find what we would call deep conceptual regularities. So what are those deep conceptual regularities? It means that they have to build representations, and representations with properties which are relevant for using a novel word. And many times it goes beyond superficial similarities. Superficial similarities can be misleading. For example, being of the same color is not always relevant. Being of the same shape is not always relevant. And beyond that, we have the children have to be able to use the novel name productively. So it's not only a question of association, but it's also the question of generalizing it properly to another reference. For example, if you start with just one learning example, in the future you might encounter an infinite number of new stimuli from the same category with the same name. So you have not to be too narrow and not too far. So a dog is all the dogs should refer to all the dogs, but not beyond that. So not wolves, not cats, for example, which are regular mistakes that are made by young children. So what would be the first starting condition of learning? And then summarizing what I just told you. So there's this kid here, and suppose he's looking at a book, and there is a couple of stimuli drawn there, and he has to learn the word apple. So what does it? Oh yeah, I don't have the. It doesn't take the. What is it? There is no.
The animation.
Hmm? Yeah, the animation. I can do without it, but.
It understands that. I mean, should work with you have a PDF uploaded.
It's a PDF.
Yeah,
It's a PDF,
But I did send the one I just gave you was a PPT.
Yeah, I know, but it worked better because the format is a problem with this. If you want, I can.
Okay. Okay. No problem. No. We were going to waste time. Okay, I can do it like that. So, in fact, the main problem is here. Do you see my arrow here? So it should be apple. Suppose you have to work. So this kid has to learn the word apple. So he has to learn the words with this particular object. And then what couple of mistakes he could make is to also name with the word apple things that are related, like apple trees, but apple trees are not apples. Or it could be tempted by a perceptual match, which is here a Christmas ball, but a Christmas ball is not an apple. And also, he should have to generalize the novel word to taxonomic matches, we call them. That is, things from the same basic level, as we call them, category, ear apple. So this one is quite close to this one perceptually, but this was a little bit different. But it could be beyond that. It could also have that he has not to learn the word apple, but the word fruit, given this example. And that, in that case, he would have to do something which is much more abstract, find other regularities that would be relevant at the level of fruit. And also beyond that, he might have to learn the word with this only apple, the word food. And from that, he would have to derive the meaning that the word can refer to a very diverse set of things, including meat here. So all of this is known as category levels and also levels of abstraction. And it's quite well known in psychology that we start with this level here, the level of apple, and that fruit or food, it's much more difficult for kids. So what I want to tell here, and maybe it's relevant given what Mario told here, especially with the kind of platform we are using now, it's a way, the way we might display, we might show these stimulus, and so that we can encourage this kind, the kind of reference we want to make here. I mean the conceptual learning behind word learning. And the main result here I want to tell you about is that comparing exemplars is just, comparing means several exemplars. For example, it's not just one apple, it could be just two apples. And two apples is better than one. And so we are going to see what happens here. So comparing examples is a powerful tool to find common and non-salient dimension. I mean things that might be behind that you don't see immediately, you have to reconstruct, but which are very relevant conceptually. Think of the concept of fruit, for example. You don't really see what a fruit is when you see fruit. And it seems that this kind of paradigm, comparing examples, it works with object names. It has been done by psychologists with object names, names of parts, action verbs, adjective, perceptual categories, and so forth. So it works quite widely. So what would be the design? Let's start here with a no comparison. It was the first thing I tried here. Here is what we do. It's a trick used by psychologists, and we tell the participant, the young kids, that they are going to learn the language of a puppet, but it could be the language of the foreigner here in this context. And we tell them, oh, in this language, this is called a DAX. And it's very simple. And we ask the kid, knowing that this is a DAX, tell me, we ask the kid, which one of these two is also a DAX? And believe me or not, in this kind of paradigm, most 3 or 4 children, 4-year-old children would select the perceptual match and not the taxonomic match. And now I'm coming to my comparison paradigm. What you see here, 2 apples, and these 2 apples were still more perceptually close to the Christmas ball. So in terms of perception, the relation between the apples and the ball are still in favor of the balls. But in that case, it happens that most of the kids, let's say 60 to 70% of them, would now choose the banana match, which we call the taxonomic match. So the correct one, of course, because it's from the same category. In any case, in no occasion in the world, we would call a DAX, or which stands for apple, we would call a Christmas ball as a DAX or an apple. So why is that comparisons are interesting for learning? For psychologists, there are a couple of reasons for that. And one reason is that when they compare, comparison is a nice situation. It's kind of invitation to align, as we call that, stimuli, both stimuli which are compared, on non-salient dimensions. So what happens here, we have those stimuli that were quite close perceptually, and probably they see that they are close to one to the other on perceptual dimensions. And then these comparisons elicit new similarities, thus thinking on, and it happens that at the end of the day and at the end of the lesson, they are much more able to find their common dimension. And that's exactly what I'm saying, the second sentence here. Comparisons would allow them to find less salient unifying dimensions. And also these comparisons tell you that maybe there is something which is, you might look at one stimulus saying, oh, this must be a property, an important property. And then you say, when you are comparing with the other, you say, oh no, it's not a very good one. So it helps you to shift from one dimension to the other. And as we will say, so comparison work, but maybe it has also its cost, its cognitive cost, as we say. So comparing is more difficult cognitively than just looking at analyzing one stimulus. And the next step is, okay, we now know that comparison, which is my main message, comparison helps for learning. But if we think about it, a very important dimension of language learning is conceptual distance, semantic distance. So I mean by that, to what extent I would generalize, to which categories, to which kind of stimuli I would generalize a novel terms. So as I said before, apple would just refer to apples, and fruit should refer to a much broader category. And children might have to understand this with exactly the same stimuli. Here is something that we did here, just to manipulate what we call that conceptual distance. So the question is, you have here what we call closed learning items. It means that we show them these things, they are just 2 bracelets, and we say in this language of the puppet, this is the language, in the language of the puppet, it's called a baxi. So this is a baxi, and this is a baxi too. So they are quite close here conceptually. Here, they are less close. It's a baxi, and this is another, and the bracelet is a baxi, but here the baxi would be a watch. And here, these are for the test phase. We just, as before, we just ask them which object would be also a vaccine. And they have the choice between the perceptual method, tire here, and then something which is taxonomically related, which is chosen to be much less close perceptually. So if, as I said before, comparison promotes taxonomic choices rather than perceptual choices, they should choose the pendant here. But it could be, so what would be what we call a closed generalization, but it could be more remote here. They might have to choose something which is like a bow tie, which might be part of a broad category, including things we put on ourselves. You see what I mean. So the question is here whether, given these two learning conditions, we will be able to generalize here or here. What are the results? Now, I'm sorry if these are graphs, but these are the tricks used by psychologists. I'm a scientist, I'm sorry. So what happened in the no comparison, this is important. In the no comparison, I didn't show you, but if you, in the previous slide, you was just showing them only one bracelet rather than two, or only one here rather than two, they would go massively for, as I said before, for the perceptual match, which here you have the proportion of the taxonomic matches. So it's only 3 out of 10 that have been, yeah, okay. It will be only 30% of the choice. So what you see again is that it's far better when you are doing comparisons. In a case of close comparison, we had 2 age group, 4 years old and 6 years old. So it's better for the 6 than for the 4. Of course, it's no big deal of here. But what is important here is that when we compare close comparison, the 2 bracelets versus the far comparison, I mean the bracelet and the watch, it works better. The generalization works better for the far comparison. And it also works better in all cases for near generalization than for distant generalization. So it's easier to generalize towards the pendant rather than to the bow tie, which is not so, which is expected because it's closer. So it's easier to understand what would be, in which term these things might belong to the same category and have the same name. So what these results show is that, again, comparison work, but comparisons is can be modulated as a function of a couple of parameters. For example, as I said, close comparison versus far comparison, near generalization and distant generalization. So given what is the target of the word, I would say, what kind of entities is supposed to refer to, you won't get exactly the same results. Some might be more difficult than others. So I'm going to skip this table. It's just to show that when you start with no comparison, we have a majority of people using most of the time taking the perceptual choices, and you say that in the far learning condition, most of the children did not use the perceptual match, and they used their taxonomic match. Okay, it's another way to show the kind of result. But what I just show you was objects, and the task was to learn the name of these objects. But it could also work with the nouns for relations. For example, neighbor is a relational noun. Addition is a relational noun. Bind is a relational noun. And we know, psychologists know quite well, that relational concepts are more difficult because it's difficult to understand what goes in this situation, because they don't refer to the objects, they refer to the relation between them. For example, if I take grasp, you don't see grasp. And well, we tested that again with no comparison, close comparison, far comparison. So more. And again, it doesn't work quite well for no comparison. Dashed line here is when there are chance in the things we had to choose with. Okay, we have the choice between these three here, for example. The thing was to cut. We had to learn the cutter for, but in another language. And well, so the lesson is, I don't have time to do more, but the lesson is that comparison again works better for these kids than non-comparison. And as I said before, and I will stop with that, is that you might think, okay, that's a nice lesson. After all, we can compare and it's better. But how many objects should we compare? Because after all, if I put more objects, it would be easier for the kid to understand. For example, here we have only 2, here 2, 3, and here 4 to illustrate the same concept. So you might say there is more evidence here than here, so it would be easier. Except that for small kids, integrating all the information is quite difficult. And what this graph shows is that they were good at 2, they were better at 3, nice, but at 4 they were less good. Their performance decreased. Just we thought the interpretation was they were too much information to integrate, and they had difficulties with that. So now it's the last point. Are all the students in the same? Are all the kids at the same in the same situation to learn? So what we did is to correlate their cognitive characteristics in terms of what we call the monitoring cognitive functions, that we say, flexibility, inhibition, etc. And what we saw is that the children who were more able in terms of cognitive flexibility, what is cognitive flexibility is very simple, is the ability to change a rule when the previous one didn't work. Okay. And we are not all equal in terms of this. It's done in our prefrontal cortex, and it can be different. And so it seems that the capacity to be flexible is an important thing for finding these relations, and these are to make sense of the comparison. Here, my colleagues I was working, Eleanor, Yannick Lagari, and this is the puppet, which helped us a lot, and my colleague Arnaud. So thanks for your attention. So thanks for your attention. So my message was, as you say, comparison, it's